Imagine if an aircraft company built a train. Well, what would it look like? What would it be powered with? Well, quite simply, you don't have to imagine it because it's already been done. I'd like to introduce the iconic looking UAC Turbotrain, a high-speed gas turbine powered train that break the world record for fastest gas turbine train. My name is Jamie, and let's get into this locomotive deep dive. If you are interested in further history of electric locomotives and locomotives in general, do subscribe and like this video, as I'll be going into further episodes like this weekly. Next week's episode will be a new series going in depth about Germany's post-war electric locomotive development, so keep tuned in for that. The Turbotrain story starts much earlier. Let's rewind the clock to the 1950s. Chesapeake and Ohio were interested in a new passenger train design, using the second generation Talgo suspension design. This meant that a pair of passenger cars would share a truck, instead of every passenger car having a pair of trucks each. The advantage of this, it would reduce the overall height by reducing the center of gravity using this suspension design. One disadvantage of using this design is that an articulated train reduces the flexibility of train length. However, one solution is to allow coupling on the two ends cars. A famous concept picture of this C&O articulated train appears in a 1959 issue of Trains magazine, Who Shot the Passenger Train? This concept train would be named the Dayliner of Tomorrow. It would feature a power car on each end, and the power cars would feature twin diesel engines, and the engineer's compartment would be on top, like the UAC Turbotrain. Due to the way the crew and engine room was laid out, it was impossible to walk through the power car and onto another power car. This feature was important as it would allow increased flexibility. However, the decrease in passenger traffic will cause a C&O to ignore the concept and focus on freight traffic instead. The High-Speed Ground Transportation Act of 1965 would be enacted as a response to the launch of the Japanese Shinkansen. It would spur new developments in the railroading industry, in a way to update and speed up services on the Northeast Corridor to be more competitive with modes such as airplanes and cars. Two major projects will be launched: an electric high-speed train, which would be later known as the Bud Metroliner. This I had covered in a previous video, so please check that out later. The latter would be a non-electric high-speed train. While the Department of Transportation was pushing for new high-speed trains, at the same time, on the other side of the border, Canadian National was wanting new trains as pooled service with the Canadian Pacific had ended. This is where the United Air Corporation would step in. The United Air Corporation would purchase the patents relating to the Daylight of Tomorrow, and would update the concept for the US Department of Transportation tender. Modifying the design, it would have, instead of conventional diesel power, it would use two Pratt & Whitney ST6 gas turbines. The ST6 were a downrated version of the PT6, which could be found in all sorts of commercial and military aircraft. The ST6 would produce 300 horsepower. One important feature of this gas turbine was that it did not require a transmission and would drive the wheels directly on the UAC Turbotrain. The gas turbines would also be lighter and smaller overall compared to the original diesel designs. This would mean that the power cars were much larger than needed. However, instead of redesigning the power cars, the interior would be rearranged. The crew component would be lengthened to add a viewing area with seating, and the power cars would be 73 feet and the coaches were 56 feet. The original walk-through design would be kept. Unlike other trains at the time, the Turbotrain was made of an aluminium structure, reminiscent of planes. This could be compared to, let's say, the Metroliner, which used stainless steel construction. One important part to mention is the Talgo suspension. This type of suspension would allow the train to tilt into curves. With this feature, the train could be 30 to 40% quicker on curves compared to conventional train sets. Two turbo trains would be built at Pullman Works in Chicago. These were numbered DOT-1 and DOT-2. From August 1st, 1967, high-speed testing of the Turbotrain sets would begin from Providence to Wesley, Rhode Island. This was allowed for testing and development for UAC to improve the sets and just learn a few things. To compare the performance of the two high-speed projects, the DOT would have a small competition between the Metroliner and the Turbotrain. During this competition, the Turbotrain would set the world record for gas turbine-powered rail vehicles, which was 170.8 miles per hour. As a comparison, the Metroliner would reach this mark very close, reaching 164 miles per hour during testing. On the 1st of January 1968, the Turbotrain would be transferred to Sikorsky aircraft of the UAC. This is notable since in later brochures of the Turbotrain you will notice the Sikorsky logo. The DOT train sets would be leased out to the New Haven Railroad, and they would be contracted out to run the train sets. With the ongoing bankruptcy of New Haven would be merged into Penn Central into 1969. Penn Central would now run the train sets on the Northeast Corridor between Boston and New York City. These train sets would be run as 3 cars, with 2 parked cars on each end, and they would carry 144 passengers. Despite the incredible top speed, it would only operate at a top speed of 100 miles per hour. And, as a requirement of traveling into Grand Central, third-rail shoes would be fitted. This was to allow Turbotrain to enter Grand Central without using the gas turbines. The Turbotrain would have an incredible first year performance-wise. On-time performance was at 90%, and it would cover the 230 miles in 3 hours and 39 minutes. With the continuous bankruptcy of railroads and loss of passenger services, Amtrak would take over in 1971. Amtrak would continue the Turbotrain service, switching to Pennsylvania Station instead of Grand Central for its New York terminal. Amtrak in 1972 would order 2 extra cars to expand the original Department of Transportation train sets to 5-car sets. Later on, Amtrak would also purchase 2 4-car train sets from Canadian National, as CN had excess cars from their rebuilding program. One of the 4-car trains was destroyed during testing runs after sideswiping a freight train. This 4-car set would be scrapped, and only one of the 4-car sets would be delivered to Amtrak. In September 1976, Amtrak would bench the Turbotrain and move them to Fields Point Maintenance Yard. This was due to the overall maintenance issues during Amtrak's service, with some Amtrak spokesmen calling them maintenance nightmares. There was a hope that Canadian National would purchase the sets. However, this would never materialize. An attempted sale was also made to the Illinois Central. However, with the condition of the sets being very poor, the sale would fall through. Amtrak would scrap them in 1980. Canadian National would have a very different experience. CN would purchase 5 7-car sets for the Montreal-Toronto service. The plan was to run 14-car trains by combining 2 7-car sets together. The Canadian sets would be made by Montreal Locomotive Works, also known as MLW for short. The Turbotrains were planned to be in service for the summer of 1967. However, issues with the train sets caused revenue service to be delayed for 1969. The reason for this 1967 was due to Expo 67, and CN wanted to showcase their brand new train at this expo. CN would market the train as the Turbo, citing plans to make the service seem like an all-new form of transport. In all forms of marketing and referring to the Turbo train, it would simply be referred to as the Turbo in Canadian service. The Turbo train would have a year of testing before being pushed into service. The demonstration run for the Turbo train was extremely unlucky. Within an hour of its demonstration run, and being full of reporters, it would actually hit a truck on the highway crossing near Kingston. Even with their lightweight construction, the Turbo train would actually stay on the track and be mainly undamaged. The train would be designed to specifically take hits like this. It would actually feature large beams on the nose to absorb the impact. This would allow the train to be repaired within a week. During commercial runs, the Turbotrain would be limited to 95 miles per hour due to things such as grade crossings and highway crossings. It would also achieve 140 miles per hour during a speed test on Canadian service. Technical problems would also plague the Canadian train sets. A big issue was the brake system freezing during winter. This would eventually cause the Turbotrain to be pulled from service in January 1969 and would resume service in 1970. However, it would be suspended from May 1971 due to continuous issues that weren't rectified. This would cause CN management to express these opinions publicly. In response, the UAC would claim that CN was suspending service due to minor issues. One factor we must consider about the Turbotrain, both in CN and Amtrak, is the unique power plant. The gas turbine required mechanics who were familiar with aircraft-based power plants, meaning that regular diesel mechanic who would be fine fixing EMDs and ALCAs would struggle to fix an issue on the Turbotrain itself. In 1971, Canadian National would rebuild the train sets, converting the 5 7-car sets to 3 9-car sets. The roof windows of the power car would be plated over due to exhaust covering the windows during service, and would also feature improvements to the gearbox, suspension, and sound dampening. The leftover cars from this conversion were sold to Amtrak in 1971. The 3 rebuilt sets would enter service in 1973, with their routes being Toronto to Montreal, with stops at Dorval, Kingston, and Guildwood. While the turbo service was an hour faster than other expresses such as the Rapido, the fastest average speed of these trips would only be 85 miles per hour between Kingston and Guildwood. The turbo train sets would finally start gaining the reputation of being solid trains. In 1978, with passenger rail travel being taken over by Via Rail, Via Rail would also take over the turbo trains as part of this new deal. On May 1979, a turbo train would eventually develop an oil leak and catch fire. This fire would destroy a power car and 2 coaches. This train would be towed back to Turcotte Yard in Montreal and would stay there until it was scrapped. The turbo train would have its final run on October 31st, 1982, when it would be replaced by the LRC train sets built by Bombardier. Despite the issues that had plagued the earlier train sets, the rebuilds would have an availability rate of over 97%, far greater than the Metroliner at its best. For perspective, it would be one of the most reliable passenger trains in North America, beating out things such as the Alco PAs and EMD E-Series. The reason for the turbo train to be pulled from service was not because it gained an infamous reputation or was unreliable, but quite simply, it became too expensive to run. The 1973 oil crisis would cause gas turbine trains to be expensive to run and would kill off gas turbine trains all around the world, such as the original APT and TGV. Unfortunately, the turbo trains wouldn't survive and none were preserved. The turbo train, in my opinion, was very unique in terms of looks, sound, and charm. How many other trains just sound like a jet engine? Quite simply, not that many. In a lot of ways, I don't believe it got the chance it truly deserved. It was rushed into service by Canadian National, and it was never truly appreciated by Amtrak for what it could really do. It had world-class reliability when the problems were fixed, and it still managed to break the world speed record for gas turbines. You may also ask, why the UAC Turbotrain? Well, quite simply, it's very blunt honest. I keep seeing the post on my Instagram regarding Rapido's new UAC Turbotrain 2.0. And, well, I would really want one for my layout in the future. Firstly, I think the CN livery just looks fantastic. I don't have a lot of CN trains. I have an E unit, and I've got a FA2, and I'm hoping to at least do the Super Continental. I think they look fantastic. I do think it genuinely looks gorgeous, and honestly, that CN livery. Not so sure about the Penn Center. I know some people really love that livery. It's just not for me. Percy, I know this sounds a bit controversial. I'd rate them highly in terms of looks as a TGV Sud-Est, especially in that orange and white scheme. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you didn't enjoy it, please give me a like and subscribe, as it does help out a lot. I did also want to say thank you to you for watching, and a thank you to my partner. Thank you, and have a good night.